Oh, welcome, welcome, welcome. Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to Care Concierge with Care Patrol, where education is the heart of everything we do. If you're new to Care Patrol, we are a referral and placement agency. And what that means is we work with families and individuals looking for assisted living, memory care, in home care, or retirement 55 plus communities. And we're paid by the providers of those services and not by our clients. Our services to our clients are free, just as our CEUs are free to you, and we're glad that you're here with us today. I'm excited about our presentation. A little about us. We are accredited by the Alabama Board of Social Work Examiners and also by the Alabama Board of Nursing Practitioners. And each of those tell us that today's content is 1.0 contact hour for nurses and social workers, also appropriate for physical therapists per their own submission to the board. And we appreciate everyone on the line. We have a unique process in that in order to receive credit for being here today, in order to receive your contact hour and certificate, you must do an online evaluation. And that online evaluation is password protected. We give the password at the end today. And in that way, the Board of Social Work Examiners tells us that this hour qualifies as a live hour or a classroom hour for social workers. Nurses will be posting this hour for you onto the ABN website within the week or so. And I'll read for you now for those of you who I know have called in by phone or are not able to see the screen and you want to know the evaluation link. I'll go ahead and give that to you. I'll give the password at the end. The link is https:// www.surveymonkey.com/r/ all uppercase letters, B as in boy, 6, N as in Nancy, Y, F as in Frank, H as in Harriet, P as in Paula. That is the evaluation link today. I'll post it in the chat room for you. Also, listen for it again at the end and listen for the password. And today we are so happy once again to welcome Wayne Rogers, who is from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Department, who has been instrumental in creating and implementing and executing on the topic that he's presenting. So we're pleased that we have an expert today, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much for being here, Wayne.
Thank you, Sean. I'm glad to be with y'all again. All right, we ready to get started?
Yes, absolutely. The floor is
Okay, man.
yours.
Very good, very good. So, all right, everybody. Yeah, I'm Wayne Rogers, Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. I'm Executive Assistant to Sheriff Mark Petway, and I was with y'all a few months ago. Glad to have everybody who was with us then, and I may say some of the same stuff again, for which I apologize. I told Sean I had probably. When I teach this class, normally it lasts about 3 hours. So, so I know when I taught it last time, I got through about an hour's worth of stuff. And when I look back at my notes, I was like, well, I can't remember exactly what it said and what it didn't say. So I may say some of the same stuff again. I apologize for that. But we're going to talk today about Alabama's crisis care system and the way it used to work the way it evolved into working, and the way we're trying to improve it now. So and I want to first of all apologize for those of you. I had several people from last time that asked me to help them get enrolled in our 40-hour class that we conducted at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. We hadn't had a chance to do that yet. We changed directors this year, and I want to apologize for that. But if you're interested, I've still got your name, and I'm going to put you down to hopefully do that 40-hour class early in 2026. Is when we're going to have the next one of those classes available to folks. And so, if anybody's interested in doing a 40-hour class in crisis intervention team training or a 16-hour class in crisis intervention team training, just a 2-day class, we have both of those available at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office. Other folks do this training as well. Yesterday, I taught the same stuff I'm going to be teaching y'all a lot about today. I taught over at the Veterans Administration, so the VA needs this too. So let's talk just generally about what crisis intervention team training is. And then we're going to talk very specifically about sort of how it works in Alabama today, how it used to work, how it works now, and how we want it to work in the future. But let me tell you the way we found when Sheriff Mark Petway got elected in 2018, and about a month after he got elected, he called me up, and I was it was a big surprise to me, Sean. I was on the way home from the Homewood Public Library. My wife and I had been down there driving back down the Red Mountain Expressway, and I get a call from Mark Petway, and I was like, "Oh, it's the new sheriff." And y'all got to understand, I've been practicing law for 30 something years in Alabama. Just a simple country lawyer. Grew up in Thomasville. Got a scholarship to go to Sanford and go to Cumberland Law School, and I've been practicing law. I've been a litigator for a long time. Now I've been involved in politics a lot, but I helped sheriff get elected. So then a month after he gets elected, he called me, and I was like, well, I wonder what the new sheriff's going to call me about. And I answered the phone. He said, Wayne, I want you to come to work for me. And I went, what? What would I do? And he said, well, let's have lunch tomorrow. Let's talk about what I want you to do. So, what he knew about me, and I think I told the story last time. I won't tell the whole story again. But for those of you who don't know my story, mental illness has been a part of my family for generations. And I've never been diagnosed with a mental illness. I've had maybe some situational depression situations, as a lot of people have. But addiction has been a part of my family for generations. But both of my paternal grandparents were alcoholics. I've had cousins who were drug addicts. I've had cousins who were alcoholics. I've had an uncle die of cirrhosis of the liver in his 40s. My paternal grandfather died driving drunk. My paternal grandmother was murdered by her second husband in a drunken rage. And her 4 kids, including my father, were standing about 20 feet away when she was killed. So the mental illness that flows from an incident like that, which happened August 1946, and here we are almost 80 years later, and there's still consequences from that going on in my family. So Sheriff knew about my advocacy, working with NAMI, working with mental illness, and he said, Wayne, I really want you to come in and work on improving the crisis care system in Jefferson County and state of Alabama, throughout the county, both for people in the jail and for people who are not in the jail, people who don't need to be in the jail. And this is the purpose and the heart of crisis intervention team training. And that is that people with mental illness are not criminals. They are people who need our help, need our treatment, need medication, need counseling. They don't need to sit in the jail. So, when I came to work for the sheriff, we started working right away on getting funding for a crisis care center. Very proudly, and I'll talk more about it later on, the Craig Crisis Care Center that's now open over on Beacon Parkway West here in Birmingham is treating at this point between 250 and 300 people a month. And y'all, best we can tell, 50 to 75 of those people are people who would have gone to jail before this place was open. So the Craig Crisis Care Center is something we're very, very proud of. And the way we get folks to that Craig Crisis Care Center is largely through our crisis intervention team training. So, what is CIT? CIT is a program that teaches law enforcement how to properly deal with people who are in a mental health or addiction crisis. This is the point of CIT International. CIT International is an international organization. We have branches in Spain and the Philippines and Japan and France, all over the country, but it's headquartered in Memphis, Tennessee. And and I'm on the national board for this organization. And our purpose is to train law enforcement in how to deal with people with mental illness and people who are in addiction crises, because everybody knows substance use disorder is it's a mental illness. And so we work with all these folks like that. So the portion of the training that I always do for these folks, and we talked about that in more general purposes last time, but I'm going to go a little bit more into my specific training, the things that I do this time. And one of the very specific things that I train folks on, and at this point, I've trained more than 1,000 law enforcement officers on crisis intervention team training. And what I train them about largely is Alabama's involuntary commitment process. Now, let's talk about what Alabama's involuntary commitment process used to be. And Sean, can people see my screen yet, or do I need to share that now?
No, your screen is present.
Okay, my screen is up. Very good. So we're looking at requirements of involuntary commitment in Alabama. Okay, so that's good. So so when and there are probably people on the screen on this call right now who know more about involuntary commitment than I do, but we're going to talk a little bit about it and how the process works and how mental health professionals and medical professionals play into this process. So first of all, you got to show, in order to have someone involuntarily committed in the state of Alabama, you have to show by clear, unequivocal, convincing evidence in a court of law the four things that you see up on your screen there. One is that the person is mentally ill. Now, this is where a lot of you folks will come into play. A lot of the people in the medical world, you have to have some sort of medical evidence that the person is mentally ill. Of course, we know one of the things different from mental illness as opposed to like getting the flu or getting COVID or getting, some like a broken bone or whatever, is once you're diagnosed with a mental illness, that diagnosis pretty much is going to be around the rest of your life. I mean, someone who is a paranoid schizophrenic, they're going to stay in that situation. Someone who has various things that are defined as mental illness, they're just not really going to go away. So one of the things the way things used to be in Alabama, and we'll talk about the misconceptions, but at one time, when you got an involuntary commitment in Alabama, it was for life. And part of the reason for that rule was that when somebody was found to be mentally ill, they were committed. They went down to Bryce Hospital and they stayed there for the rest of their life. Now, does anybody know how many people were at Bryce Hospital back in the 1960s? Because the number will shock you. If you know Bryce Hospital now, there's about 300, maybe 325 people there. In 1970, there were 5,000 people there. There were 4,000 more Alabamians down at Searcy Hospital in Clark County, down close to where I'm from. But Searcy Hospital, they were largely divided by the white Alabamians who were in long-term mental health care were at Bryce, and the black were at Searcy. They were segregated in that way throughout the 1960s. But there were 5,000 people at Bryce, there were 4,000 people at Searcy. They were being taken care of on a 24/7, 365 basis by about 300 people. And anybody want to guess how many doctors there were on staff at Bryce Hospital in those days? I'll just tell you, there were two. 5,000 people being taken care of by two doctors. One of them was a psychiatrist, the other one was a general practitioner. Now, when the lawsuit was filed in 1970, the White versus Stickney lawsuit was filed, the folks who filed it, and some of these people are still alive, by the way. One of them is a buddy of mine I actually had lunch with yesterday. His name is Jack Drake, and Jack was a young lawyer at the time, helped file this lawsuit. And what they said in filing the lawsuit is the great majority of these people don't belong here. They don't need to be here. They are not mentally ill. What they found when they started doing discovery and talking to people who are in Bryce Hospital, the majority of those 5,000 people there and the majority of those 4,000 people down at Searcy were battered women. These were women whose husbands had been abusing them, had been verbally abusive, physically abusive, any other way. And the woman throughout the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, when the woman went in and said, "Hey, I can't take it anymore. I'm leaving you. I'm going to file for divorce. I'm going to move back in with my parents or whatever," the husband would go to the local probate judge. The probate judges, remember, have the authority, full authority to do involuntary commitments. And the husband would go in and say, "My wife has, say it with me, gone crazy because she wants to leave me." And the probate judge would commit these women to Bryce Hospital, and they would stay there for the rest of their lives. You can go to Bryce Hospital today. There are cemeteries there, and the cemeteries are almost all females or almost all women. Some of them are women who lived at Bryce Hospital for 35, 40, 45, 50 years after being committed for no reason other than they had threatened to leave their husband, that they wanted to get away from an abusive situation. So when the lawsuit was filed, they basically the lawsuit said, "Hey, these folks don't belong at Bryce Hospital. They're not mentally ill." And they did a long, there was a lot of trial testimony, a lot of things found out about what was happening at Bryce. If anybody's ever seen the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend going to see it, because that's what Alabama's mental health care system was like at the time. If you remember, Jack Nicholson's character in that movie gets a lobotomy at the end of the movie. A lobotomy is a surgery that takes out a part of the brain, and it's the part of the brain that essentially is your higher functioning part of the brain. It's what makes you a human being. And this was a common procedure at Bryce Hospital throughout the 60s and throughout the 50s and 60s. Sorry, not into the 70s. Find out what happened there in just a minute. But throughout the 50s and 60s, that was a fairly common procedure. There was high dose psychotic medication, and some of these women were simply kept drunk, for lack of a better term. A lot of the time they were given high dose medication, and if they ever made noises about, "I'm not really mentally ill, I want to get out," they just gave them more drugs. There was trial testimony, y'all, that at one time the staff of Bryce Hospital dug a pit and on the grounds of Bryce Hospital, found the two biggest guys there at the hospital, men that were there, put them in the pit and had them fight, and took bets on the fight. I mean, this is what our mental health system was like in the 50s and 60s. A lot of great intentions when it was built, when it was started. Bryce Hospital was built. It's one of the first mental health hospitals built in the country, built back in the 1870s, 1880s. A lot of good intentions behind it. The whole purpose of it got so perverted, and it did so because our law said once a person had an involuntary commitment order, there was never any review of it after that. Just the person stayed in commitment for the rest of the time. So, and the linkage I'm making here on this is, once you have a mental illness, you're going to have it for life. The problem with it is, constitutionally, why do we keep that person confined for the rest of their life? Because, just the fact that they are mentally ill doesn't mean they should stay in confinement for the rest of their life. Think with it. Think with me here for just a minute about the Constitution. I'm a lawyer, so I like to talk about the Constitution. So, we said in the Declaration of Independence, before the Constitution, 10 years before the Constitution, Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence that all Americans have three fundamental rights. And y'all know what they are. You might remember it from fifth grade civics: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's the three rights that all Americans have as a fundamental right. Now, are those rights absolute? They are not. They're fundamental, not absolute. And what a fundamental right rather than absolute right means, if the government has a compelling interest, those rights can be overcome. Okay? So the government has a compelling interest when someone commits a murder. Okay? You have a right to liberty, correct? But you commit a murder, the government's compelling interest to punish that murder overcomes your right to liberty, and they're able to put you in jail. So, what had happened here was the fundamental rights that these folks had, and you think life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, two of the three of them are being violated here, right? You can't pursue the same happiness you can when you're being held at Bryce Hospital for the rest of your life, and your liberty has been taken away. You cannot leave the place. There are barbed wire fences all around it. There are people with guns telling you can't leave, right? So, two of your three fundamental rights have been taken away for the rest of your life. Essentially, it was a life sentence. So, the case that was filed in 1970, it was filed on behalf of a 15-year-old kid whose name was Ricky Wyatt. Ricky Wyatt had been in Bryce Hospital since he was 10 years old. Now, I told you about all the battered women that were there. They filed it on behalf of a child because they thought these women might not get sympathy from a jury, but a child is going to. And this 15-year-old child had been at Bryce since he was 10 years old. Here was Ricky's backstory. At 2, his mother abandoned the family. They lived in Troy, Alabama, down in Pike County. At 2 years old, his mother abandoned him and left him with his dad. His dad got remarried. His stepmom was fine with him. They lived together for a few years, but then they got divorced. And the stepmom left, so he's just with his dad still. When Ricky was about 8 years old, his dad got married for the third time. And this wife didn't like Ricky very much. She had a child of her own. She wanted to have a child with a new dad. And she started whispering to her husband, Ricky's dad, hey, Ricky's been getting in trouble at school. He's had a couple of fights. He's not doing well in math. We need to go down to probate judge and have him committed because he's obviously mentally ill. Now, the kid, Ricky White, was not mentally ill, okay? There was nothing wrong with him. He had gotten a couple of scrapes at school, nothing wrong with him that every 10-year-old in the state of Alabama probably hadn't done in 1965. But Ricky White was sent to Bryce Hospital at 10 years old in 1965, and he might have stayed there until he died had it not been for the lawsuit that was filed in 1970. So when they filed the lawsuit, what the court said in the lawsuit was, you, state of Alabama, cannot put someone in involuntary commitment because of a disease that they are suffering and then fail to treat the disease for which they're being confined. Okay. So y'all think with me what an important ruling that is and how that changed the entire complexion of mental health care in the nation. Because Alabama was not the only state doing it this way, y'all. Literally every state was doing it this way. This is the way it was everywhere. So Alabama was the first place that somebody filed a lawsuit, and I won't go into why they filed a lawsuit here in Alabama, but the ACLU knew that they had a sympathetic judge and Judge Frank Johnson down in Montgomery, and Judge Johnson would hear the case. And Judge Johnson's the one that made that brilliant ruling and said, you can't confine somebody because they're sick and then not treat the sickness. So what he ordered the state of Alabama to do, well, he saw, there's 2 psychiatrists for these 5,000 people. He said, well, you got to change that. You gotta have, no doctor can have a caseload of more than 50 people. So now I want you to think about that with me. So that's one, let's see, that's one psychiatrist for every 100. That's 10 psychiatrists for every 1,000. So that's 50 psychiatrists that the state of Alabama needs to have hired at Bryce Hospital, and they've got one, right? Well, how many of you out there think that the state of Alabama went out and hired 49 new psychiatrists to come to Bryce Hospital? Well, if you think that, I got some, beachfront property in Kansas, I want to say, because that is not what happened, okay? Could the state of Alabama have found 49 psychiatrists in the country who would have been willing to move to Tuscaloosa, Alabama? I don't think so. So what they did was they started examining everybody's individual case. And what they found was of the 5,000 people at Bryce, 350 of them were actually being treated for mental illness. The other 4,650 didn't even have a treatment plan. They weren't even pretending that they were treating them. And so they had to let all those people go. Because remember, the court has ruled you can't hold this person in confinement if you're not treating their illness. So 4,600 of them were gone within 2 years. Same thing happened in Searcy. They ended up with just a couple hundred of those 4,000 people that were actually mentally ill. And today we see about 325 beds at Bryce Hospital is all that's left. And that's about what we need. So going back to my slides here. So you have to show by clear, convincing evidence that the person is mentally ill. They're mentally ill now. They're going to be mentally ill. But what you have to show in addition to that, unlike the old days when essentially all you had to say was the person's mentally ill to go to Bryce, now you have to show, see point number 2, because of that mental illness, the person poses a real present threat of substantial harm to himself, herself, or to others. Now, we think of that in a broad terminology. If the person is going to hurt somebody else, or are they going to hurt themselves? I'm going to talk just a few minutes. There is actually a third circumstance now that we've modified the law. And this is, Sean, this is where, we got to a certain point in the 70s and 80s, 90s. And then now we're pushing it toward. And I'm going to show you the stuff that I've been advocating for and working on, including a major change in the law in 2022. I think was a very positive change that we'll talk about in just a few minutes on another slide. But let's talk about here the person who's posing a real substantial threat of illness. I had a neighbor, y'all, he was paranoid schizophrenic. That was his diagnosis. We knew he was mentally ill. So our neighbor, one night my wife and I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning, and our neighbor, he lived 3 or 4 doors down from us, and we wake up to him cutting his grass at 2 o'clock in the morning. Because sometimes people who are mentally ill, they don't, he didn't see things the way everybody else did. So he started cutting his grass. But so, people start calling the police. Hey, man, there's a guy cutting the grass at 2 o'clock in the morning. Does that person get taken into involuntary confinement? Absolutely not, because they're not a substantial threat of harm to themselves or others. They might be harming your sleep pattern, they might be waking up in the middle of the night, but they're not going to cause any harm to anyone. Now, that same guy, a few weeks later, he I'm driving home from work one afternoon, and I see at his house there's three police cars gathered around. There's an ambulance, there's a fire truck, and they're starting to say, "Oh my goodness, Dave!" I thought, "What has Dave done now?" I knew he'd been cutting his grass in the middle of the night before. What's he done now? I get home, ask my wife what's going on, and she said, "Well, Dave acquired an AR-15. He's been shooting up the neighborhood. He had busted out some windows. Fortunately, he did not hurt anybody." But he did bust out some windows. He shot up a couple of cars, that were just like cars that were parked in driveways and stuff like that. At that point, then you have element number two. Because of the mental illness, the person is posing a real, present, substantial threat of harm, right? So there's a lot of things in between there, y'all. But think about the difference between the person cutting the grass at 2 o'clock and the person who's got an AR-15 shooting up their neighborhood. There's a lot of difference there. So this is what you have to show that the person poses a real present threat of substantial harm. Element number three, I want to talk about just a minute and sort of explain to y'all how this is the key point from that 1970 decision. This is sort of the codification of what the judge ruled in that case. And what actually ultimately happened was there were lawsuits filed in all sorts of other states: Louisiana, Ohio, Minnesota, California. Those were the next four lawsuits that were filed. But eventually, a lot of states were like, why are we having to file a lawsuit? We know that what we're doing to these folks, these people who are mentally ill, we know it's wrong. And we're going to change it by our statutes, by our law. And what they established was this element number three. The individual who is being committed, you have to show that they will continue to experience mental distress and deterioration of their ability to function independently if you don't treat them. Okay, so this is the important part of that element number three. You have someone who's they have mental illness, but they're high functioning. They're going to work, everything's going well for them. They're going to church, they're going to work, they're getting along with their family, and they're way up here. Functioning is very high level. They have that mental health crisis hit and they start to come down like this, right? So this is where we have crisis intervention. This is why we call it crisis intervention team. This is where our team wants to intervene on the person when they're going through a crisis. We want to intervene at as early of a point as we can. We want to be able to show them, to get to the person before they continue that downward spiral. But once we get to them, then we put them into involuntary commitment. Then the person stabilizes. Maybe they stabilize down here. They've been functioning up here, but they get in the crisis. We intervene. We stabilize them here. Now, what previously would have been the law before this lawsuit was filed in 1970 was you would have to say, well, let's get this person way back up to here before they would let them out. That's not the way it works anymore. The involuntary commitment system is only designed to get the person on the way down, stabilize them, and as soon as they stabilize, they have to be released, right? You are not responsible. The state is not responsible for getting them back to a high functioning level. Sometimes that is not possible, right? Oftentimes that's not possible. Now, they may, with good treatment once they get out, they may rise back up to that high functioning level that they were at. But the point is, we can't violate their constitutional rights by holding a person who is stabilized, they're doing okay, they've got their medication, they're in counseling, everything's okay. They may not be functioning as high as they were, but we don't have to take that person back up to a high level of functioning. We release them. So now the fourth element we'll talk about real quick, and then we'll go on to the next slide, and that is that the individual is unable to make a rational decision regarding treatment. That's an easy one for us to prove, okay? When the sheriff's office has someone in involuntary commitment, we never worry about proving that one because think with me here. The person's mentally ill, they're a danger to themselves or others, and they're getting worse without treatment. If all three things are true and they don't want treatment, that's not a rational decision, right? They're a danger to themselves or others. They're mentally ill. They're getting worse. It is not a rational decision to say, I don't want treatment. Now, let me stop right here and mention one thing. Voluntary commitment is a real thing. Lots of people go into voluntary mental health commitment. Y'all, what we are seeing with our crisis care center is when we take someone involuntarily into the crisis care center, sheriff's office, Birmingham PD, Hoover PD, Gardendale PD, a lot of these folks that we're training in crisis intervention, they'll take some of these folks involuntarily into the crisis care center. And when the person gets there and realizes, hey, they didn't take me to jail, they brought me to a place where I might get some help, then we start the paperwork because we're mandated by law that we have to, on the next business day, whatever it is, the next business day, we have to file an involuntary commitment petition because we can't hold people without an order from a court more than 72 hours. That's the longest we can hold anybody. And the only reason it's 72 hours is because we bring them in on a Friday night. That gives us until Monday to file a petition, right? But we have to, it's mandated. If we bring them in on Monday night, we got to file on Tuesday morning. We bring them in on Thursday night, we got to file on Friday morning. So it's as quick as we can, we have to file and get this issue before court. But what we have found happening now is we end up not having to pursue the petition because when the person gets into crisis care and sees they're going to get their medication, they're going to get some treatment, they're going to get counseling, they're going to get group sessions, those people are like, hey, I want to stay here. I want to get treatment. I want to be here voluntarily. You don't have to have a court order me to stay because I want to be here. And so we've actually filed fewer petitions than we thought we were going to have to. All right, let me move on to the next slide because I'm taking way too long to talk through some of this. But let me see. Uh-oh, where am I doing? What am I doing here? I want to get to the next slide, and I'm trying to figure out how to do it. There we go. All right. So yeah, I finally figured it out. All right. So what happens when somebody is awaiting a petition? Somebody there's a petition's been filed. The court has ordered the person to be picked up. What happens? And I'll talk through this just real quick. The civil division of the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, or in smaller sheriff's offices, don't have divisions, but the sheriff's offices are responsible for these pickups. They often happen in a big rush, y'all, when a hospital bed becomes available. And now, if you want to get scared a little bit, if you live in Jefferson County, let me tell you, when I checked on the list last week, there are 95 individuals. It says 90 on here, but it's actually the numbers up to about 95 individuals who have been adjudicated to have all those things I just told y'all about. They're mentally ill, they're a danger to the community, they're getting worse, they can't make a rational decision about treatment, and yet we don't have a bed for them. We have nowhere to put them. So there's 95 of those people out in Jefferson County today. Occasionally, and notice I said the priority pickups is set by the probate court. Now, occasionally you'll have somebody who's way down the list that'll jump way to the top of the list. Like, just every now and then. I'm not saying this has ever happened, but just maybe it has. Somebody's on like number 65 on the list, and they call in a bomb threat to a police station, something like that. That person suddenly is going to go from number 65 on the list to number one on the list. And possibly the person's going to have a warrant for their arrest, and they're no longer going into involuntary commitment. They're actually going to the jail. It's a tough call, and we have to train our folks when we do CIT for police officers. We have to very carefully train them on when do you arrest someone and when do you put someone in protective custody? Because the person who's been taken in for involuntary commitment is not under arrest, but they're being taken in for protective custody. So it's the difference in how the police officer handles the situation with the individual is the paperwork, what they fill out when they get the person to where they're going. Because a person under arrest and a person in protective custody, it looks exactly the same. I'll tell you why by telling you a little story. Something happened in Texas about 15 years ago. There was let me get a drink of my Diet Pepsi here. There was a sheriff in a small county in Texas. If anybody knows anything about the county system in Texas, they have like 8,000 counties. Like everybody's house is a county to itself. I don't know. It's not quite that bad. But they seriously have like 250 counties, and they're all small. So this was a small county sheriff, and there was an elderly man who was like the two of them had known each other their whole lives, grown up in the same community, they knew each other well. The elderly man was mentally ill, been mentally ill his whole life, and the sheriff had picked him up numerous times and brought him into involuntary commitment numerous times. The sheriff forgot that a law enforcement officer's first responsibility is always safety. It never changes. That's what they're responsible for. And that's what we train them when we do CIT training. We're like, okay, you got to keep everybody safe on the scene. So this officer forgot that. And because it was an old buddy of his, somebody he knew well, and somebody he'd taken in many times, he just put him in the back of his police car, did not handcuff him, did not search him. 10 minutes later, the old man pulled a revolver out of his belt, reached through the front of the car, and shot the sheriff in the head and killed him. So, yes, he was in protective custody, but that sheriff did not handle things right. Anytime we're taking somebody in for involuntary commitment, it may look like that we're arresting that person, but we're not. Protective custody and arrest look the same. It's just the paperwork you fill out at the end. All right, let's go to the next slide here. Elements of an involuntary commitment petition. I'm not going to go through this with y'all because this is more for something that like for the officers when I train them. So let's go to the next slide and talk about common misconceptions. A lot of these hearings are not even held in a courtroom, y'all. They're instead held in Jefferson County. All the hearings are held in the hospital room. The probate judge goes to the hospital where the person who's been involuntary committed, where we've taken them in protective custody, put them in the hospital. The judge will go there and hold the hearing right there in the hospital room. The judge will come over to the crisis care center and hold the hearing there. Um, there's also a misconception that people win these cases. An individual who's mentally ill is going to win the case. That's just not reality. Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, I can find no one here who has ever lost one of these cases. Once law enforcement makes this determination that the person should be in involuntary commitment, we can't find anybody who's ever lost one. Now, let me step back and say families sometimes do lose these petitions because what we see in these situations in involuntary commitment sometimes is a family that's in a dispute. There's an individual who's mentally ill, and one child thinks that they need to be involuntarily committed, the other child thinks they don't. And so the child who thinks they need to be involuntarily committed files a petition, and the other child fights it. And just at that point, it ends up being a really nasty, messy hearing. And sometimes the families will lose those. But if it's law enforcement involved, it's almost never lost. One of the biggest misconceptions is that people who are committed end up in long-term confinement. Now, you heard what I said earlier. That's the way it was before 1970. If you got an involuntary commitment, you're going to be there for life. Thank goodness it's not the way it is anymore. The way it is now is the reality is most people are less than 30 days. In fact, the median, if y'all know what I mean by median, half or more than this, half or less than this, the median in Alabama now is down to 14 days. So most people who are involuntarily committed are in for 2 weeks, or half of them are in for less than 2 weeks, half of them are in for more than 2 weeks. That's it. Okay. There's also a kind of a misconception that when somebody has an involuntary commitment hearing, that they only have one. They just have the one and they go in, they get treatment, they're all better, right? No. Our record, one of our social workers here at the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office has one individual who has been in and out of involuntary commitment 17 times. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, it's an individual who struggles. They've been unhoused in various parts of their life, but getting that person out of, off the street and into some kind of treatment, if we have to do it 17 times, by gosh, we're going to do it 17 times. All right. So let me do one more slide here, Sean, then we'll stop and take some questions because I want to talk very specifically about where we're headed. Okay. So I told y'all the big advance in that 1970 lawsuit, right? Things got a whole lot better after that. Bryce became much more. Now, I guess I should tell y'all one bad twist on that. The So the state of Alabama actually increased funding for mental health by 350% in the 2 years after that lawsuit was decided. Okay. But you know what they spent the money on? I won't make y'all guess. If we were live and in person, I'd make y'all guess, but I'm just going to tell you since we're not. They spent the money on building a bunch of new buildings at Bryce Hospital. Well, remember what I told you, there's 5,000 people there, and 2 years later, it's only 400, 350, then down to 300, then down to 250. So there are buildings on the Bryce campus now that were never occupied. What happened was the legislators found these construction companies that spend a bunch of money on building these nice big buildings to say we're going to do this all this great treatment for these folks, but then they figured out the people didn't need to be there in the first place. They let them all go, but then the money had all been spent on construction. So that actually bumped the mental health budget up to where it needed to be, and once all the construction was done, things did get better. But y'all will remember, some of you I know remember better than I do, during the Robert Bentley administration when the mental health budget all of a sudden became not a priority anymore. And Governor Bentley and his folks cut about $40 million out of the state's yearly budget for mental health. They closed a lot of mental health centers around the state. And, we're supposedly we're going to do these community mental health centers, and a lot of those just never materialized. And we ended up with a lot of mentally ill people out on the street, honestly. So under KIV's administration, things have been a whole lot better. Crisis care has become a big priority. We now have 6 open crisis care centers. We have the one in Birmingham that we worked on so hard, Craig Crisis Care Center here, but they also have them in Huntsville, Tuscaloosa, Mobile, Montgomery, and Dothan. So there's 6 of those open around the state now. And we actually found out a couple of weeks ago, this was great news, that the budget for the Craig Crisis Care Center here in Birmingham, which had been 7 million a year, next year is going to be 8.7 million. So it's going to be an additional 1.7 million dollars that the state's putting into the Craig Crisis Care Center. And it's because they're doing such amazing work, y'all, that because they're seeing so many people, and they need to hire additional staff because so many people are finding it to be successful. But let's talk about the changes to Alabama's involuntary commitment law in 2022, because this is something we advocated for. And Sean, if it's okay with you, I'll talk about this and then we'll stop and take questions for the rest of the time because I've been talking too fast here. But so these modifications, y'all, were very important to us. We pushed for them. And what this did was brought Alabama's involuntary commitment law in line with most other states. Okay, because before October of 2023, this law was passed in 2022, became effective in October of 2023. So it's been 2 years now we've had this law. The first thing we want to change was that the judge can now consider 2 years worth of behavior leading up to the day of the hearing. Before that, the judge could only consider the incident which was brought in front of the judge at that particular time, like this very tight window. And that made no sense really, because if an individual, think about the individual who's having a struggle, but then they might get better for a few days, they might take their medication, then they get off their medication, they start on a downhill slide. The judge needs to know those sorts of things. So now the judge can take a 2 year window into consideration when making this decision. Now, the more important modification we got was this. Real and present danger, that second element that we talked about earlier, that the individual may cause, allow, and inflict serious bodily harm upon himself, herself, or another individual. We wanted a very strict definition of that. And the last part of my slide here is the most important. It also includes when the mentally ill individual, that's the respondent in my slide, is unable to satisfy his or her need for nourishment, medical care, shelter, or self-protection, so that there's a substantial likelihood of death, serious bodily harm, serious physical debilitation, serious mental debilitation, or life-threatening illness. What does that mean? Okay, so before this law was changed, it was all things that the mentally ill person might do to someone else. This law now reads something that someone else might do to them because of their mental illness. And let me explain that to y'all. You have an individual whose family, they're mentally ill, the family's known they're mentally ill, maybe they're drawing disability benefits, and the family wants to keep that person at home, and they may deny them their medication. They may deny them food. They may deny them proper medical care. They may not take them to the doctor when they need to because the family might be depending on that person's income from their disability, things like that. So what this allows a law enforcement officer to do is actually investigate if we find a mentally ill person who we think is being mistreated by someone else, law enforcement can now go and actually extract that person from that circumstance, put them into involuntary commitment while an investigation is conducted, usually by DHR, of what's been happening to the person. So an individual who falls in with the wrong crowd, think about an unhoused person who shows up in town, they've got mental illness, and they all of a sudden find, the worst person they could possibly be around. All of a sudden buddies up with them because they want to steal their shoes, that sort of thing. So we are now able to extract people from those situations and put them in involuntary commitment, not because of a threat that they're making to someone, but because of an external threat that comes to them. So Sean, I've talked too much. There's so much and so rich. There's so much rich material in crisis intervention team training that I didn't get to talk about, but I want to stop now and give everybody a few minutes to ask questions. If you guys have questions for me about the things that we're doing, the things that crisis intervention is meant to do, because our goal, I mean, I would love for every law enforcement officer in the state of Alabama to get this training because some of our police departments will say to us, well, I want to confine this training to just 4 or 5 people. Well, the problem with that is those 4 or 5 people, and I understand having designated mental health officers. I want every department, every sheriff's office, every police department to have well-trained mental health officers who are called out, when there's a hostage situation, when somebody's dealing with a crisis. I want that. But I also want that 16-hour class. I think every law enforcement officer in the state ought to have at least that 16-hour class because they need to know, because they're going to end up dealing with a mentally ill individual. Every law enforcement officer is going to do that. It's just there's no way to avoid it if you're ever going to be on patrol. So, all right. So I'll be quiet now, Sean, and see if anybody's got any questions for me or if you got questions for me.
I do as we're waiting on others. So my question is, you mentioned earlier that DHR would be involved in a certain scenario. What agencies really are involved in the whole intervention team?
Yeah, so the ones that the folks that I'm just going to tell you that the people that we have trained a number of folks from the Department of Corrections, which was very interesting to me. But there are a lot of mentally ill people in the Department of Corrections, and those folks have been more interested than I expected them to be in this type of training because they actually find the de-escalation portion of our training to be very valuable when they get inside a prison. For instance, you will see that situation where the where an officer who's trained in de-escalation is able to take 2 inmates that are about to get into a fight with each other and use some of the de-escalation techniques that we teach in crisis intervention team. They can use that. So we've had a number of DOC people. We've actually had staff from Bryce Hospital come and do our training. People who are part of the Bryce Hospital staff. We've had folks from police departments all over the state, sheriff's offices all over the state. We've had folks from DHR. We've had folks from the Department of Mental Health. Trying to think who else. UAB, folks from UAB, and medical personnel from a lot of different hospitals want to know sort of how the system works here, particularly if the hospital has a mental health element to it. We've had those people come in, but the DHR folks who do this and what is the Adult Protective Services at DHR are the folks that would be most involved in what I was talking about in extracting someone from a difficult situation.
Got it.
Mhm.
And so I'm curious, can you give a small primer on de-escalation techniques?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. You sure can. Which is now this is something that I watch and I'm always amazed by because I am it's, as I like to say, I am not law enforcement, nor do I want to be. I work for a law enforcement agency, but I am not APO certified. I've never held a gun. I don't own a gun, and I have very large people with lots of guns around me all the time. Thank goodness. But so I never feel like I'm in danger. I live downtown. I love living downtown. I'm never in danger. But de-escalation, Sean, the most important part of de-escalation is the tone of the officer's voice. because what the folks who teach this, and again, I don't teach this portion of it, but I've seen them teach it many times. The tone of the officer's voice when you're dealing with a criminal, when you have someone who you know is a bad guy, and you've run them down in a backyard somewhere and tackled them, you are as rough and loud and harsh with that person as anybody is going to be in any situation. And law enforcement, that's what they train. They, have a commanding voice, talk to them loud, and just really be very forceful in what you say. When you're dealing with a person who is mentally ill and in a crisis, the opposite is true. You want to speak softly to the person. One of the most interesting and strangest things, and I have seen it in videos time after time, Sean, that is calling the person by their name. So when a law enforcement officer shows up and it's say an individual is in a crisis, and what our folks have had to deal with, y'all, it's been everything from an individual walking with no clothes on down the street carrying a high-powered rifle to, going into the bedroom of a teenager holding a gun to their head. That this is the type of situations. So let's take the situation of going into the bedroom with a teenager holding a gun to her head. What we do, what our folks are trained to do when they show up on scene to that situation, when they're trying to talk someone down from that, they immediately ask someone who knows them, what's their name, what's their situation. And calling the person by their name is one of the most important things you can do. You can and say their name repeatedly, and speak to them in a very soothing tone. Don't like. There's a great presentation. I saw a guy, a mentally ill, like a criminal who's got a knife. You yell at him, drop the knife. You yell drop the knife at a mentally ill individual. You can yell it at them 100 times. They're not going to drop the knife. They're just going to get ever more agitated, and possibly go after someone with the knife. So so those are some of the very basic stuff that they teach. They also try to talk to the person about exactly what's been happening in their life. Try to find the thing that's got the individual who's into this crisis. Try to figure out what has caused the crisis. The other thing that our law enforcement officers are trained to do is keep the person alive, keep them, in this situation until a trained professional can show up on the scene. And I will tell y'all, one of the things that we are working toward is like what's called a co-response model. If anybody out there knows what I mean by a co-response model, there are many states in the country have gone to these co-response models. Colorado is one, Oregon has done this, Arizona has done this. And the co-response model, in that situation, the law enforcement officer is almost always going to be the first person there. I mean, y'all, it is until you get into law enforcement, you just don't really realize how often, like, a deputy is the first person on scene, a police officer is the first person on scene, and they're not trained to deal with everything they see when they show up. But we do try to train them to stabilize the situation until someone with more experience shows up. In the same way, they may be the first person on scene with someone with a heart attack. Okay, fine. You do what you know when someone's having a heart attack, and then when the paramedics get there, turn it over to them. It's the same thing with this co-responder model. You get the police officer out there, they try to get the person stabilized, but then when the co-responder shows up, and the co-responder should be a social worker, a licensed professional counselor, a psychiatrically trained RN, any one of those kind of people, they will know more about the situation, and they'll be able to de-escalate the situation even further. So the law enforcement officers oftentimes are just try to stabilize the person. I'll tell you the story. We did come upon a guy, and there are certain mental illnesses, I'm sure y'all know about them, where the person gets very hot on the inside and they want to rip all their clothes off. So our deputies actually came upon a scene one time with a guy carrying a high-powered rifle, and he was completely naked walking down a city street. And if you saw what happened in Rochester, New York, a similar situation up there, they run towards the guy and they wrap him up in a blanket. They cover it. They ended up killing the guy. They smothered him to death. So when our deputies came on that situation, they asked the guy's name. He told him his name. They started talking to him very quietly. and say like, "Hey man, why are you out here with the gun? What are you doing with the gun? What's going on here?" You try to find out, something about them and just carry on a sort of a casual conversation with them. And what happened in our situation, the reason you didn't read about it in the news is this guy realized what had happened here, realized he was in a crisis, and just very calmly handed that gun over to the deputies, and they were able to, get him wrapped up in a blanket, put in the back of the cruiser, and took him home, or what took him to crisis care, and eventually he got to go home. So, this is the techniques that we're trying to teach. And I probably didn't answer the question great, but that's just some of the things that we do. And I'll let you go into another one, Sean, because we're about to run out of time. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I just so you said that you're waiting for the co-responder to show that the
Hmm.
co-responder is a clinician, a nurse, a
Right.
social worker.
Right.
Where do they come? Are they part of the Craig
Well,
Crisis
see
Center?
that so that's the model we're working toward. We don't have that model yet. They don't really do that yet. What happens now is our folks connect back to the Craig Crisis Care Center if they're in a situation where, and we there are a few occasions where we can get a co-responder out there. The other states are very far advanced beyond us on this, and there are states. I know Oregon, Colorado, Arizona. I know at least those three because I have good friends that live in all of those. They actually, if they know it's a mental health crisis situation, when that 911 call comes in, the 911 operator dispatches both law enforcement and mental health personnel. We don't do that here yet. That's the model I would love to see someday. What is happening now more with us is the law enforcement officer gets in touch with the Craig Crisis Care Center and is actually on the phone or on a video call with someone back at the Craig Crisis Care Center getting advice on what to do. Occasionally we'll get someone out to the scene, but most of the time now it's just the law enforcement officer who's doing the response, and the law enforcement officer takes the person to the Craig Crisis Care Center for further treatment.
Got it. Well,
Oh
you're
yeah,
right. We're
I
up
saw somebody
against the
say that.
hour.
Oh yeah, oh man, I saw somebody say that Shelby County does have somebody that goes out on occasion now, and they certainly do. That's one of the things. Shelby County's doing some great work in this area, I should say.
Oh, well, that's good to know. I hope
Yeah.
that others will follow suit.
Hmm.
As we're at the end of the hour, I'll read. Thank you so much, Wayne. It's been
Thank
fascinating.
y'all. It's been great to be with y'all. Love it.
I'll read the link again for anybody that joined us late. Our evaluation link, which you must complete in order to receive credit for today's hour, is https colon // www.surveymonkey.com /lowercase r / all uppercase letters with numbers, B as in boy, 6, N as in Nancy, Y, F as in Frank, H as in Helen, P as in Paula. And our password, which you must have to complete the evaluation, is CIT, capital CIT, the acronym for Crisis Intervention Teams. That is
I
the
love it.
password. Thank you so much, Wayne. And I'll be in touch. Look forward to having you back. I know we'll have requests to have you back, and I hope you'll join us again.
I love to, man. Thank you so much. Enjoy being with y'all.
Many thanks rolling in. Thank you all for being here. Join us on Monday. I believe it's the 20th is the date. We'll have another CEU. It's free. This one is on top chronic diseases. We'll also look at a little bit of social determinants of health in that presentation. You can always register on our website at carepatrol.com. And you can always look at this presentation and others on YouTube. If you go to YouTube and search Sean Barnes Care Patrol, we have about 150 CEUs recorded that you can take for credit. Thanks everyone for being here. Thank you again, Wayne. It was wonderful. And we'll
Thanks,
see everyone
everybody.
soon.
Have a great day.